let's jump into it. So the structure for today will just be on for an hour. We will do kind of Naomi and I will interview each other. We'll talk about our books, which I have right here, by the way. It's really funny. Naomi's got this giant screenplay outline workbook, and then mine is this tiny thing that fits in your back pocket. So vastly different sizes, but we'll be talking through those. Yeah, we'll be talking through those books, and then we will do a Q&A with everybody. We'll try to provide as much time for that as possible to answer your questions, and then we'll do some giveaways. So Naomi, do you want to talk about what you're giving away?
Yeah, I actually thought I would give a small bundle of books, including my book, your book, and a little film journal. And I think the only conditions for my bundle is that you have to be able to receive mail. So I need to be able to send it to you.
Nice, very cool.
Yeah.
And I'll be giving away a copy of the book, and then also a free year to our Script Blast members screenwriting community. I know some of you on here are already in there, but hey, if you win and you're already in there, you still get a free year. And then everybody on the call, actually, I'll give a free month as well, so you can go in and check out all our free resources and that kind of stuff.
That's great.
So. Yeah, but just a reminder, everybody stay muted. And by the way, you can go ahead and ask questions as you think of them. Just drop them in the chat, and we'll start going through those towards the end of the call. So first, Naomi, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us how you got started in all this and your writing journey.
I will. I just wanted to check really quickly that you're recording the session.
I am recording.
Okay, good. Just because I had a few people email and ask if there would be a replay. So, okay, cool.
Yeah,
I'm Naomi.
We'll find a spot. Oh, yeah. We'll either post this. I'll probably put it on the podcast, the audio of it. So we'll see how that goes. Cool. And then also we'll put it up on YouTube somewhere.
Nice. Okay, great. I'm Naomi, and I recognize a few names in the crowd here. But for those of you who don't know me, I run a website called writeandco.com. I am a script consultant and a screenwriting teacher. I teach workshops, and I used to teach for Save the Cat in LA. And let's see, I just really quick background. I got my start in the industry about 20 years ago, although I don't like to say that number. Working on the development side of things. So I worked a lot with writers, developing projects, finding projects, and trying to get them in a state where they were like ready to go. And then I went to work for Blake Snyder on his second book, doing research, breaking down movies for his second Save the Cat book. And then after that, I just went freelance, and I've been consulting ever since then. That was like a dozen or so years ago. So yeah. That's me.
That's great. That Save the Cat goes to the movies. Is that the one that you did?
Yes.
Yes. It's such a cool resource. I use it all the time of like, what's a similar movie to what I'm trying to do? And I go back and find it in there, and it breaks it all down. It's a very cool book.
Yeah, I thought it was really useful, or I have found it really useful when I have like a new story idea. And I'm sort of like trying to kind of figure out like, what's the shape of this story, just kind of broad strokes. And you kind of flip through there and you're like, oh yeah, it is sort of similar to this, or it kind of fits into that, Save the Cat genre or whatever. So that gives you kind of a little bit of direction, and then you can kind of develop it from there. I always found it really useful in that way.
That's awesome. That's super cool. I've been using it for a year, so I didn't know that you were involved in that. Super cool.
Yeah, I watched all 50 of those movies multiple times. Yeah, it was a really good crash course in story structure, because like when you watch the same movie 3 or 4 times in a row, and then have to like kind of break down like, okay, how's that structure put together? It's a good practice.
That's awesome. Cool.
Yeah. So how about you?
Yeah, quick intro on me. I'm Hudson Phillips. I started writing again an embarrassing long time ago, like Naomi's number. It's probably been about 17 years now that I've been doing the writing thing. And it's somewhere along that path, I decided I didn't want to rely on other people for my success. And so I started making indie film. And here in the Atlanta area, I've got 2 produced features. The first is called This World Alone. It's out on Hulu right now. And the second one is in post. We just shot it in January. But I've been writing for years and years, and very early on found some success, had a script optioned by Lionsgate Films, and it was kind of like the biggest like success I could have, and then just everything fell apart and went wrong with that project. So much so that the two guys that I wrote with ended up giving up on writing, and I started over as a solo writer. But that whole process just broke my heart so much that the industry and just the nature of creative arts chews people up and spits them out, and people get frustrated and they bail. And so that broke my heart so much. I started Script Blast as just a place online that's a safe spot for writers to talk about those frustrations, to let the other people connect and find empathy, and to know you're not alone, and to know that it happens to everybody, no matter what level you get. And then along the path started creating resources to help writers navigate both the kind of mindset of writing, the productivity of writing, and then practical writing tips as well. And so I've been doing that for a few years, and just love connecting with other writers.
Awesome.
Yeah. So let's start with your book, Naomi. Let's first of all, how and why did this come together? What I know you've got a long history of teaching this content, but when you're getting ready to pull together a book, why outlining?
Yeah, honestly, the idea was given to me by students, by people that have been through my workshops or that I've worked with in consulting, and who were just sort of like, I really wish you would put all of this information together kind of in one spot, or I wish I had, some way to kind of organize my thought process as I'm developing a story and kind of collect all of my ideas and choices around a new project. Just trying to kind of not streamline the process, because we know it's not a linear process, but having some organization to it. I think a lot of writers get overwhelmed with the process of going from barest of ideas to developing it fully. Is my audio still okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, just making sure. So writers just were asking for kind of a way to organize their development process. And so I kind of started thinking about it, started outlining the book, like what would I put in there? How would I sort of guide somebody through, like, okay, if you have an idea, what's the first thing that you can start thinking about? And I realized that, like, to me, I feel like, I know we always say that it's not a linear process, but I see so many books that are sort of like, okay, first you figure out the plot and then you figure out the character, or first you figure out the character and then you figure out the plot. And I realized that, like, when I'm teaching and when I'm working with writers, it's such a like three legs of the stool kind of thing. Like, you start with one and then you move over to the other one, but then that informs what you're doing, with plot, and then that informs your choices with character. And so I tried to kind of impart that in the book, where it's like, you might start with your idea, but then you want to start thinking about the character that belongs in that idea. And then when you kind of have some grasp of that, then you move back to plot, or start thinking about, the shape of the story that's going to serve that character best and give them what they need for the journey and stuff like that. So anyway, long story short is that really it was people were asking for it. And so I thought, oh, that's a good idea. I want to put a resource like that together, where writers feel like they have kind of a little bit of a guide through, taking an idea into a full outline, so that they feel ready and confident to write the script.
I love that. And I love the analogy of the three-legged stool. I think that's so important. And traditionally I would always start with plot, and then I'd have to like shoehorn characters in. It would just never work. Then you really do have to plan everything equally, so that one of your legs is not longer than the others. So tell me, what about writers? Because we hear famous screenwriters who say, "Oh yeah, I don't outline." So why do an outline to begin with? Why do you really advise your students to outline?
Well, a bunch of different reasons, really. I think, especially when you're starting out with screenwriting, there are so many things to remember, so many parts of it to learn. I always say that it's like a collection of skill sets that you have to sort of be good at all of them in order to write a really good screenplay. And I think that thinking through a lot of the choices that you need to make in a screenplay and putting a screenplay together, doing that before you're staring at the blank page is very helpful for a lot of writers. Not, everybody's different and your process is your own, and you should do, I think, as much pre-planning, as you want to before you write. But I've been in that position myself too, where I had an idea and I thought, this is definitely a movie. And then I sit down and I'm staring at a document and I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, what comes first, and then where does that go, and then also how do I write dialogue, and how do I put a scene together? And so I think, to me, it just makes sense to kind of take the whole process and break it down into baby steps and just tackle one little thing at a time. So it's like one manageable task at a time. And for me, that's what putting an outline is. Putting an outline together is. It's like breaking the process down into manageable steps and then kind of putting those all together into a map for yourself, so that when you sit down to write the screenplay, you have some, idea of how you're going to get from page 1 to page 100 or whatever.
Yeah, I love that of thinking of an outline as a useful tool. It's a necessary step in order to not just start writing, but in order to finish writing. And when you like flip through this book, it really does take you step by step of how to get from nothing all the way to you're ready to write, and not just ready to write, but you're ready to finish, which I think is a very, very useful tool. Because look, maybe you are a natural writer and structure comes very easily to you, character comes very easily to you. You can sit down and start writing. But inevitably, you're going to hit that midpoint of your screenplay, your second act, and you're going to start to struggle. And you're going to say, maybe my premise doesn't quite live up to what I thought it would. Maybe these characters don't quite work like I thought they would. And so I think pre-thinking through all that and going through all those steps helps you finish, which is, ultimately the biggest kind of priority that we have in starting a script, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I've seen, and again, myself included, I've seen that happen where you get really excited by an idea and dive right in to to writing pages, and then you get frustrated, or, you lose steam, or you feel really lost because you haven't kind of like thought through the whole thing, and that's not to say that you have to know every single moment to moment thing that's going to happen. Like I said, everybody has their own process, and you should do as much planning as makes sense and feels right to you. But I do think having a map that you can fall back on, even if you deviate from it, right? Even if you plan it all out and then you sort of go, I found something better. The characters led me somewhere else when I was writing. At least if you have something kind of like a safety net to fall back on, you have the ability to follow those whims and then go, okay, well, maybe that didn't work out the way I thought it did. I can kind of revert back to the plan that I had and at least get to the end and then see what's there,
Yeah. It's funny, I got some feedback on a script I wrote recently where, because I go through an outlining process and all that, and generally the story still kind of finds itself when you start writing, and you tweak and go back and change things. But I got this note which was like, your character starts at this place and your character ends at this place, but I didn't buy the journey from A to B. So I'd be curious if you had any advice on, I'm sorry, my dogs are barking. I don't know how annoying that is. If you had any advice on, all right, I've got this outlined, I've checked all these boxes, but how do you make it a living, breathing thing? How do you make sure that you're tracking with a character or a plot, story, beats, whatever, as you start writing as well?
Let me see if I understand. So do you mean like as you're writing, sort of checking back in with the outline to make sure it's still serving you, or is that
right? To make sure that it's still working, but also to make sure that you are hitting those beats. I think it's easy to kind of say character starts here, character ends here. It's a lot harder to make that a natural progression.
Yeah, so I think my kind of tool for that particular thing is just making sure in the planning process that you're actually thinking about whether the physical journey or the external journey is able to cause that change or to produce that change in the character. So that being part of, kind of the outlining process is thinking through what are the steps of that character's arc, transformation, progression, whatever you want to call it, and thinking about the things that they're going through. Do I see how those things can produce that change or cause that change, right? So are they kind of pressing on that need that the character has to change? And so we can see how those two things go hand in hand, right? Because that's ultimately what you want. You want the external stuff to cause the internal stuff, right? And then the internal stuff changing causes different external actions. So it kind of all works together. In terms of like making sure, I guess, that you're checking in with the outline and that the outline is still guiding that as you're writing. again, this might not work for everyone. I tend to break the outline up into 8 sequences, and then I write a sequence at a time, and I sort of do like a sequence outline. So I kind of know what's happening in each of those scenes within the sequence. And then I try to write like a fast draft of a sequence at a time. So I kind of have that momentum. Those scenes are all kind of written in a very skeleton form. And then I can, because I know what's there, I can take my time to go back and like flesh out the scene and see if there's a more interesting way for things to happen, or, definitely improve the dialogue and stuff like that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it's awesome. And,
Okay.
and I do the 8 sequence thing as well, in part because I like to, I'm addicted to accomplishment, right? So I want to check boxes as I go, and an entire script takes so long, but a sequence you can do a lot faster. And you also do this thing in your book that I love, that you take these moments to celebrate, of like, hey, you did this, congratulations, let's, take a moment. Why is that important to you in the writing journey?
I think just from personal experience, it's like, it is such a long process, and it's always a longer process than you think it's going to be when you start out, or at least it always has been for me. Like, I'm like, oh, this script is going to write itself. It's such a brilliant idea, right? And then you sit down to write it and you're like, oh, I am 6 months in and I've got like 2 drafts, and there's no end in sight or whatever. So I think it's just really, I like to celebrate little wins, because I think that's kind of how you keep yourself going. I also am a big fan of not necessarily waiting to celebrate, but like I use snacks and chocolate to keep me writing. You know what I mean? Like, I need to have that stuff in hand so that I can force myself to stay where I am in my seat and keep writing. And then when I'm done with like a sequence or whatever, I will celebrate and have even more chocolate.
Yeah, so. I love that. And I think oftentimes we forget to celebrate because the losses and the failures are so loud when we're writing, that we forget about the wins. And so taking those moments to remember them and like write them down, and go back and look at what you've actually done over the past years, track your progress, stuff like that, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Write down the little wins that you've had, because it's so easy to forget what you've done and what you've accomplished, and just remember the disappointments or whatever. So if you can go back and just look at what are all the things I've like checked off the list this year, I think that's really motivating.
Yeah, I think it's huge. So how do you know you've got your outline? How do you know when you're done with the outline and you're ready to start writing? Because you could stay in outlining mode forever, right? We love thinking, and maybe another version of that question is, how do you know when or how long should you spend on the outline? Is there a number of amount of time or amount of check boxes that you have to get before you start writing? When do you start writing?
Yeah, well, I think unfortunately there isn't a hard and fast rule about it. So, it does take some, I think for everyone, it takes a little bit of trial and error, and you'll probably not get it exactly right the first time, right? Because I think the most common thing for newer writers is getting really excited about an idea and diving into a draft without kind of figuring very much out about the story first. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes it just makes the process, sort of longer and more front loaded, right? So there's no hard and fast rule, I don't think, but I think that if you can sort of, well, in the book, there's a 40-point checklist, so you can go through that list first of all. But if you don't have the book, it's totally fine. I think it's very useful if you sort of evaluate your outline in the same way that you would evaluate a script. Like if I'm reading a script and I know who the protagonist is, I know what they're trying to achieve throughout, in basically every scene. I know when they've succeeded or failed, kind of definitely at the end, right? I know where the conflict is coming from. I can see that there's conflict ongoing. There's something at stake. It's like all of those things that we look for in a movie that we're watching or in a script that we're reading. You should be able to have a sense of that in the outline too, right? Because the outline's a map for what you're going to write. So I think as long as you can kind of like keep those criteria in mind, those like evaluating kind of criteria, and look at your outline with that same eye, like can I see the whole story here, in a story that works and a story that tracks and that I'm sort of engaged in from scene to scene, that I think that's enough, right? Like if you can do that, you don't have to have every single scene figured out down to the minute, right? You have those broad strokes, and that may be enough to kind of guide you through writing.
That's great. All right, last question for you is what's, someone picks up the book, what's the one takeaway that you really want them to start implementing in their writing life?
That's a good question. I don't have a ready answer for you, but I think my best or my biggest hope for writers is, and it's kind of the point of the book, is like, I hope you'll just go out and write things. I hope you'll just try it and not spend years and years and years learning theory and never writing anything, because I think you learn so much more just from going through the process, right? So whether you outline or don't outline, just write things and try to get them to a completed state so you can see what you have and you can learn the lessons that it has to teach you,
Yeah, I completely agree. That's what I love about this book so much, is it's a workbook, so it actually forces you to do work on your screenplay. It's not just theory, it kind of combines both. Because when I first started writing, I probably spent just 5 years just soaking up every book and podcast and article that I could to learn how to write. And then I wrote my first screenplay and I knew nothing. That kind of stuff helped a little bit, but it's not until you start writing that you actually learn all the lessons, and writing a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and I will say that, every single script that you write is going to bring its own unique challenges. So you can learn theory, and it's great to understand kind of like basic theory of how a story is put together, but you're not really going to learn how to do it until you do it, until you put those things into practice and go, oh, okay, I see what they're talking about when they're like, you have to, have something for your character to try to do over act 2 or whatever it is. So I just think I did a very similar thing, I think, that you did. I had an excuse because I was working in development. So I was like, I'm going to learn everything there is to know about screenwriting because it's, it's helpful at my job. But so I didn't actually write anything for, the first 5 or 6 or 7 years that I was learning, about how to be a screenwriter. So same. Well, thank you for your great questions. That was awesome to talk about.
For sure. And I'm actually going to use the workbook, because now I have a copy too, on the next screenplay I do. So I'm very excited to see how it feels versus how I do them now, because it really does. I mean, that's the other thing about screenwriting, is when every time I sit down to write, I feel like I'm starting over again, and I'm kind of pulling stuff that I've learned on previous scripts and applying some new things, but it's a new process every time. So I'm excited to take these ideas. And by the way, everybody, Screenplay Outline Workbook, you can find a link to it at the same thing, the site that you clicked on to get here, scriptblast.com/Zoom. And there's a link to Naomi's workbook, and I hope everybody picks it up, because it's a pretty awesome and powerful resource. Yeah.
Thank you. That's so nice of you to say. All right, I'm going to turn the tables and put the focus on you, and start with the same question. So how did this come about?
Yeah, so it came about by me being bad at writing characters. I kind of mentioned before that, because I write, kind of big budget action adventure kind of stuff, a lot of times it starts with plot. And so I was like, oh, this would be cool, like a cool idea for a fight scene or a cool world building kind of thing. And I would start there, and then I would come up with a random character, throw them in this world, and it would just never work quite right. And I'd get a lot of feedback of, I love the ideas, but your characters are so weak, or I didn't believe them, or they're too passive, things like that. And I think it's something that a lot of writers struggle with. And, we hear this term, character-driven screenplay, but what does that actually mean? And so I just collected, all the ideas that I've learned from writing screenplays and from other places that I found, of how to write an unforgettable character. How do you write a character who has an arc, who sticks with you over time, who has a clear, reason that they're doing things, and is tied tightly to the rest of your screenplay. And then the second side of it is what I really learned. The key to writing unforgettable characters was to learn how to live an unforgettable life. And so a lot of the things that we apply in screenwriting, these lessons of how to have a great character, can also apply to yourself, of, taking risks and having a clear why, especially with, screenwriting, which is this total up and down journey. And so the line I say a lot is, you're not a failure, you're just in your second act, right? And it's a thing that we don't get to recognize a lot until we dive into, screenwriting structure and that kind of thing, that really does apply to our own lives a lot of time as well.
That's great. Yeah, I really like the way the book is sort of, each chapter has a different sort of principle, right? Something that you want to make sure that your character is doing, or you want to make sure that you think about for each character. Yeah. Considering you're saying that you started out being bad at characters, is there one of those principles that you think is either the most valuable, the most must-have, or that was the most useful to you to learn personally?
I think really the biggest thing for me is just unforgettable characters are authentic. So I walk readers through a process in this book of going back and looking at your own lives, and figuring out who the characters were, like looking at life-changing events. They could be positive things, they could be negative things, but who are the characters that influenced you in that situation? What was the lesson you learned? How did it change you as a human being? What was your takeaway? Who were you before that moment? Who were you after that moment? How did you respond to it? And I think doing that exercise, it does a couple of things. And one thing that I'm really proud of in the book is it's as much about you as a person as it is about you as a writer. But doing that exercise, for one, it helps you reframe those past experiences. A lot of times we are, traumatized by past experiences, and we're like, why did this happen to me? Why do bad things happen to good people? But when you go back and look at them with a little bit more purpose, you realize that those things, made us who we are, and they did serve a purpose in the same way that those types of things happen to our characters. When our characters go up against struggle, they change. And so it helps us recognize that, when we're writing screenplays, we really are writing, it's not just movie stuff, it's real life stuff. And so the more you can apply, authentic emotions to what you're writing. So when you go back and you look at those painful moments, one question I ask is, what was the authentic emotion? So often we think, grief is moaning and wailing, right? And so I walked through losing my best friend in college, and my emotion to that was one of numbness. It was my body shut down as a way to cope to that, and that felt so much more real and authentic. And so when you're able to tap in some of those, emotional experiences in your life, you can write characters that connect more to audiences. Because it's real. And it's not about finding pat answers, because nothing in real life has a pat answer, but it's about presenting these emotions on screen in a realistic way, because when we see our emotions presented authentically, we find healing just by seeing it, just by knowing that we're not alone. And a lot of times people will say, write about what you know. And so I always say, write about what you feel. So write about those honest emotions. Even if you're writing, because I write, big, crazy space battles, even if you're writing that, you can still tie true emotions to it. And that's what makes people connect to it.
Yeah, I really love that exercise in your book of like identifying a big event. You have it, both good and bad, but identifying a big event that really had an impact on you, and then kind of walking through the steps of like, what were your authentic emotions around that? Because I totally agree. I think that writing authentic characters requires you to be in touch with what were you feeling? Or what have you felt, and how can I kind of convey that in authentic ways? And again, I'll totally agree with you that those, I think, are the moments that you come up with that don't feel cliche. They don't feel like I've seen this in a million other movies, or it's the go-to response that you assume because you've seen it in so many movies that everyone's going to have. Right. but it allows you to find really unique moments, right, that you can put into scenes. And then because the emotions are real, people who see that are like, I've felt, they recognize that feeling, and they identify with it, and they feel very seen and heard, which is exactly kind of how you want people to connect with your stories. So yeah. I really love that exercise. How did you come up with that just for the book, or was that something that you did in your own process before?
That's a great question. I don't remember where that came from. I mean, I've taught this material a lot, the Unforgettable Characters stuff. And so it came out of that. But I think it actually came from not a writing exercise, but a life exercise. I read a lot of self-help books, and I think it was something out of that I kind of applied to writing because I found it very useful for myself.
That's cool. So because you now have gone through the production process for your own movies twice, how has that, what have you learned about characters from actually, seeing your scripts produced and having actors come in and have to go through the scenes and live in those characters? What other lessons did you learn from that?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer just because it's different every time. I mean, the biggest thing is just the way that actors bring characters to life is phenomenal to me. I can't act to save my life, and so just that people are able to tap into their core emotions and bring something new to it, which is probably very similar. I haven't done any acting training, but I imagine tapping into trying to find the key emotions to a character for an actor is very similar to a writer. The thing I love about actors is they only have to worry about the one character, whereas a writer, you're worrying about all of them. As a director, you have to worry about all of them. And so actors always have really unique points of view on their character. And I'm not a director, I'm a writer, but my directing partner trusts in that a whole lot of like, no one's going to know this character better than the actor. And I think that's really true. On the practical side, just dialogue can be cringy when said out loud. So it's always, you always hear the tip of read your scripts out loud or do a table read with friends. And I think it's a great idea because, there's nothing worse than, hearing your line that you were so proud of on the page just sound awful coming out of someone's mouth. So we always leave it open to an actor to kind of ad lib and find their voice in it. But yeah, I don't know in terms of, writing characters and what works on screen and what doesn't. It's just, if it's not there on the page, it's not going to be there on the screen. And so I think doing all this, hard work ahead of time is extremely necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the dialogue thing for sure is I think a lesson that you probably learned. Well, you had done shorts before your first feature, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So you had the experience of like seeing your dialogue performed and realizing, oh, that's a really long sentence, or I have a bunch of the same sounds all together that makes that impossible to say.
Right. Yeah.
I've even found that like the way I mean, obviously, I think everybody does this, but the way I write anything is different than the way I speak. It's much more casual when I'm just speaking off the top of my head or whatever. Yeah. And so the few times that I've had to write myself, a script to record something, or, somebody else wrote a script for me, it's such an eye-opening thing to go through when you're like, oh, this perfect sentence that I've constructed that's like grammatically correct is really hard to say in a way that sounds natural or, gets my point across. So
yeah, it's a very different language writing and saying it out loud. And again, kind of like you said, it just takes a lot of practice, a lot of writing dialogue and trial and effort.
Yeah.
Trial and error.
Trial and error. So when you guys were getting in pre-production, getting ready to shoot, did you, because you mentioned that you sort of allowed the actors to find their own voices in the characters, did you do much, I guess, rehearsing or not? I'm assuming you were on set, but the director, did he do much rehearsing with the characters, and did the characters evolve at all in that process? Or?
We did. It was a truncated rehearsal on this one because of COVID, just made it very difficult for us to get together. So we did one table read with everybody masked, which was, again, not the ideal way to be acting. But most of it came out of being on set and, the actors coming to me or the director and saying, hey, we don't feel like this works. Can we rework it? So, we're constantly rewriting on set, constantly letting them play and try things. Me rewriting some lines, letting them play with the lines. There's some things that, it plays with this script in particular plays with like stand-up comedy. So there was like a bit in the comedy bit where they're like, this feels like borderline offensive. Can we tweak it? Like there's stuff like that, that you just don't think about when it's just you and the page. And then once you take in everyone's experiences on set, we even had it was an assistant art director come up and say, hey, I think you should change this line. And she was right, and so being open to other people's opinions, I think is huge, and being, not protective. I actually prefer, like, I kind of hate it when actors do the line just as I wrote it, because I want them to bring something to it. And maybe it's my own, I don't have to take responsibility for it if they change it or something like that too. Yeah.
Cool. So last question for you. If you had one takeaway from the book that you wanted to make sure writers really got, if you could give it away, what would it be?
Yeah, it's really that authentic thing. And I'm trying to think of I'll tell the story that I tell in the book that I tell all the time, and it's actually where we got the name for our production company, which is called Mirrorbox. And the story is about this doctor. His name is V.S. Ramachandran. He's a neurologist, so he studies the brain, and he worked with people suffering from phantom limb pain. So, a guy that had lost a hand, he still feels like that hand is there. He still feels like the hand is balled up and causing him pain all the time. So he invented this device, which was called a mirror box, where it's a box. It's got two holes in it. It's got a mirror that kind of slants sideways, so that he would take this patient and they'd put, his two arms in the holes, and he'd see a reflection of the hand that was still there. So it would trick his brain into thinking that both hands were there. And he would say, ball up your fist, and then release it. And when the patient would release it, that pain would go away. And so to me, that is very much what writing is. It's very much what art is, what movies are, that when you write with enough authenticity, when you write with enough honesty, when you tap into those emotions, that people are able to find healing just by seeing it reflected authentically. And so that's kind of moment for me when I first heard that illustration, was at a point in my life where my writing was tanking, my personal life was tanking. It was just a very frustrating part in my life, and that story really gave me a reason to write. And I think having a why is so important, just like for your character to have a why, to pull them through the story, for you to have a why as a writer. What's the reason that you write? So that became the reason that I wrote. I took these experiences that I had, these traumatic experiences I experienced as a kid, and throughout college, and well into my 20s. And it was like, how do I write about those things while still writing about aliens and robots and stuff, where people can find healing in those honest emotions. So yeah, I think if people can walk away with just that personal, being able to add that personal touch to their writing, I think it would be night and day.
Awesome. That's great. And sorry, I said that would be the last question, but I'm going to ask you just this technical one. Are you planning to do this in an ebook form, or is it only physical that people can get?
Right now, it's only physical unless you join Script Blast members, and there's a free download in there. And again, I'll give everybody a free link to access that. Even if you hop in for a month and then cancel, so that you can get your ebook and get out, that's totally fine too. But I want people to experience it and see this awesome community that we have, of just that's really uplifting, and offers practical help to writers.
Yeah, and you're always doing, I know you have a ton of lessons and, sorry, I'm trying to look for the right word, courses and tutorials and things that are already existing in there. So I think even giving everyone a month is so generous, because they can come in and learn a bunch of stuff from you in that time. So
yeah, more than happy to share that with everybody. But yes, eventually we'll do a ebook version on Amazon too. I'm a book nerd, and I love holding them in my hand. So I at least wanted to give this a shot before doing the ebook version.
Yeah, and I do think it makes a good writer gift too. It's so pretty. I love your
it's
cover,
tiny, and it's only $7.99. Fits in your back pocket, but it's packed with content. So hopefully people find it useful. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so I know that we have at least one question. I was going to encourage everyone, if you have questions that you'd like to ask either of us, go ahead and put them in the chat. And I think we have a couple already. So let's look at those. So I'm going to assume that you can answer all of the questions, Hudson. So I'm just going to ask you. The first one is, what is the difference between an outline and a synopsis? Go.
Oh gosh. What I would say, and look, hey, we can differ on this and go back and forth, volley it. But no, I would say a synopsis would be a summary of the story. Like you just let's say you just walked out of a movie and you're describing it to a friend. That's what a synopsis would be. For me, an outline is a much more detailed, step by step, describing what happens in each scene that really follows the character journey. I would argue an outline is for you as the writer in order to write your screenplay, and a synopsis would be more to give someone to try to help sell it. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. That would be exactly how I'd say it too. So I always think of a synopsis as something that's, part of a pitch, or you might write it just for your own clarification to kind of like get the story straight in your head. But it's going to be, a synopsis is a tricky thing, I think, for writers who are planning a story. I think it's good because you can get your story out in broad strokes and sort of get that, 40,000 foot view and like, okay, what's the overall picture that I'm going to be creating. But I always say that writers are so good at writing that it's easy to do the like writer's sleight of hand when you're writing a synopsis and make it sound good. But then when you actually go to do the outline, you're like, oh, I didn't think about the middle part. I don't actually have act 2 figured out. So I totally agree. I think the outline is can be a much more detailed document, but it does, I think in all cases, it sort of forces you to think in almost like the X-ray of a body. So it's like, what are all the parts and how are they put together? Whereas a synopsis is a little bit more like I'm giving you the gist of the story, right? In kind of like pretty terms. So that would be, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. And I actually find that having both is really helpful because I've outlined a project before, and then in order to send it to a producer, I did a synopsis version of that. And in doing the synopsis, it kind of points some things out that didn't work in the outline. Like just seeing it in a different frame of just describing it straightforward made me realize that some pieces were missing. So I think doing both really influence each other.
That is a really good point, because I've done that where I had to do like a one pager, to like a 1-page synopsis that inevitably ends up being in a page and a half or 2 pages. But having to see if you can kind of condense the story and convey like what's entertaining about it and sort of how it works in 1 page, I think also it forces you to reframe it and think about it in a different way. I was just going to tack on to another thing you said though about sending something to your producers or whoever to kind of get buy-in for your story. I would encourage people not to send outlines unless you're working with someone who knows how to read an outline, because a lot of times your outline sounds really boring or linear, or it might sound really confusing because the way it's going to be written, kind of how all the scenes connect, but what you've put in the outline, because it is such a concise document, usually is sort of shorthand. And sometimes when you send that to somebody who's not familiar with the story or not familiar with outlines, they're like, this doesn't, make sense, or it doesn't feel like a movie. So be careful about sending your outlines out, I guess.
Yeah,
is what I'm saying.
No, I completely agree. This last project I did, we went through 3 rounds of outlines, super detailed, crazy amounts of notes. And I was like, guys, hold on. Let me just do this 1 pager. And then if we can sign off on that, we can get going. Because you get lost in the weeds, right? So yeah. That's great.
Yeah, and sometimes if you've written the outline and someone else is looking at it, they get stuck on like one thing that you threw into the outline as like a note to yourself, and they're like, this part, what's happening there? And you're like, no, just ignore that. That might not even be in, So, yeah. All right, that was a great question. Okay, so next one. Gabriel says, I'm great at generating characters, dialogue, and inciting incidents, but terrible at finishing projects, often getting snarled in Act 2 considerations. My biggest block is that I am averse to the formulaic, where the writing hits all the beats in a kind of predictable, we've seen this a million times way, which often leads me to abandon ideas. And I struggle with crafting story breaks that feel unique and authentic rather than well-trodden. Any advice?
Ooh, this feels like a Naomi question. I want you to tell us from an outlining perspective.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll give you the advice that comes to mind, really. You probably did you hear that? That was my dog shaking his ears. He sounds like Scooby-Doo. Anyway, so my advice my advice would be to try this and see if it helps. I always think that when you're breaking a story or you're figuring out how it works, think about what you want to happen or what needs to happen first, and don't worry if that sounds simple or cliche or like everything else that you've ever seen. And then the next step, after you've figured out what needs to happen and how the whole story goes together that way, so what's happening at sort of each major turn, then you can think about how is that going to be conveyed in an interesting, cinematic, entertaining scene, right? So once you know what you're trying to accomplish, then you can brainstorm 10 or 20 or 30 different ways, the how that will occur on screen, how it'll be dramatized. And that, I think, breaking that process into 2 steps for me is really useful, because I think probably all of us do this, where you have like a perfect image in your mind, right? You're like, I have this visual, this is what's happening. But if you haven't like thought about what you're trying to accomplish there, that image or that moment in the script might not accomplish what you want it to accomplish, or you might be sticking it in somewhere that it doesn't quite achieve what you need it to achieve in the plot. So I think breaking that down into 2 phases, 2 steps, allows you to really make sure you're accomplishing what you need to accomplish. And then also you're giving yourself time to have that creative, kind of brainstorming to figure out what's the most interesting way that I can create that effect on screen, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's awesome. And I think you're right. And I think a lot of times people get scared of outlining because they're like, oh, I've seen the bad version of, hitting all the beats. But no, I completely agree. I think you can still have a quote unquote formulaic outline and it not be a formulaic movie. Exactly like you said, I always do this process is called get to 10. So you never go with your first idea because chances are you're subconsciously pulling it from somebody else's movie or something else you experience. So always come up with 10 alternate ideas. So, what is the weirdest, possible way or less conventional way in order to hit that beat? Another exercise I like to do is you list out, or you take maybe a word, spell your name, Hudson, right? And then come up with an idea that starts with each letter, or do the entire alphabet. And so like A, what's an idea that starts with A? B, what's an idea that starts with B? And it's just a way to like open up your brain in a way and get past cliche. But I think that, I don't think that those 2 things are mutually exclusive. I think that you can hit formulaic beats and do it in a really unique, interesting way. And I think Gigi might write stuff where it's like, I don't want my character to have a character arc, which I think is possible too. Your character doesn't have to change in the end, but they have to be on some sort of journey where whatever that final choice is, good or bad, or whether they embrace it or not, is still there, so that we're seeing them, not choose it at least.
Yeah, totally. And I think the thing about the beats, I'm putting that in air quotes, that feel formulaic, it's those big turning points in the story generally do have a common feeling, right? They have a common purpose, and they have a common effect that you're trying to create on the audience, right? Like at the inciting incident, you're trying to make us feel like the story is starting now, right? So there is something that inciting incidents across most movies sort of have in common. And I always think it's that effect that you're trying to have on the audience. So that's why I think, breaking it down into 2 steps is so helpful, because you kind of take the pressure off of, you're like, okay, this is what the inciting incident needs to accomplish. So let's make sure that I know what I'm doing here. And then you can, like I said, you can brainstorm all those different ways. And I love that idea of going through the alphabet and coming up with a different idea for each letter. That would really force you to stretch your muscles, but that would be great, right? Because then you could think of, you probably have several good ideas to choose from of like, what would be an interesting or unexpected way for this inciting incident to happen,
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. I love that key point of assigning a purpose to each of those beats and kind of an emotion to it. Like, what do you want the audience to experience? That's huge.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so Nathan, how do you recommend, or sorry, this is from Nathan, how do you recommend keeping spontaneity and or the joy of discovery when working off an outline? Oh, it's a good question. Because I think that's the big fear that everyone has about outlining is, I'm just going to like sort of, by the time I get to writing pages, it's going to feel like I'm beating a horse, or beating a dead horse, right. Whatever that phrase is. That's not a very nice phrase, but
hey, it's terrible. Already dead. Yeah.
I just realized how awful that sounds. Anyway, So again, I do think that this is something that you can kind of use that tool that I was just talking about, or that exercise where your outline, you can think about what needs to happen, and sort of stay on that side of things. And then I think the creativity or the spontaneity can come from figuring out what's the most interesting way to make this happen. So you could have, if you don't like working off of an outline and you don't want to get too detailed because it's going to stifle your creativity, I think you can totally come up with a bare bones outline that's sort of, broad strokes of your 8 sequences or just your major turning points and kind of notes in between. And then when you get to staring at the blank page, if you prefer that kind of intuitive, writing process where you go, okay, what am I trying to accomplish in the next 10 pages? What's the most, how do I see that playing out? Like, what's a really cool way that, gives you the opportunity to be spontaneous and creative in the moment. Also, I just find that writing scenes is no matter how much you have figured out, it's always like there's more stuff to figure out. So I personally think that just writing scenes is always a sort of spontaneous, creative process,
Yeah, even if you know where you're going in a scene, there's so much that still needs to be created in it. The other way I would say to be spontaneous with your writing is to do it out of order. So that, maybe you feel like you're copying and pasting from your outlining and that's getting boring. We'll skip to like the last scene, or skip to a scene that you see most clearly and start writing that. And I find that kind of builds energy and momentum of writing the scene you can see most clearly, and then you can go back and get back to the mundane part.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, because that also can be a really good way to prompt yourself to come up with unexpected choices, right? Because if you're not leading in from a scene you've already written, it forces you to think about like, okay, so where are my characters coming from? What might they have been doing right before this? Or like, what's a cool transition maybe that I can use, I can plant here and use it later, so writing out of order kind of forces you to approach scenes like with a little different sort of attitude. So yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Okay, so from Brett's iPhone, I'm curious if the outline book differentiates between or addresses writing for features and or TV. I ask because I primarily write features, but I'm about to embark on trying an adaptation for a pilot limited series. So I'll take that one. So the outlining book is directed at writing features specifically. However, I do have a little PDF that I put together a couple of years ago for people who are writing TV, who are trying to figure out how to develop a pilot and write a pilot. And I will give that to Hudson to post in the Script Blast members group so that you can download it. That's free. It's just something that I did with my mailing list a couple of years ago, where I was like, here are the steps, because people were asking, again, that's where all of my writing comes from. People were asking, like, how do you take an idea and turn it into a TV pilot? So I did like an email series that was just step by step. Here's what I'm doing this week to develop a TV pilot. And then I just kind of put that all together in a PDF. So I'll make that available for you guys to download if you're interested in that.
Cool. I'm definitely interested in that. I've done like one pilot a long time ago, and so I'm interested in trying that again, because I've just been doing features for so long, just to have another piece of portfolio. And so I'm trying to learn as much as I can about pilots now, which it feels so different to me. What's a quick difference between pilots and features from an outlining perspective that you see?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of people are interested in writing TV right now, because there has been so much good TV in recent years. The big difference is that in a feature, you're usually focused on sort of one character and one kind of one main cause and effect pathway, right? It's like there's a strong through line and everything's kind of connected to that one A story, even if you have subplots, right? They're attached to that main story in some way. Whereas in a pilot, you actually have so much more leeway, there's so much more possible. But I think sometimes people come at writing TV thinking, oh, it'll be easier because a pilot's shorter than a feature, so I only have to write 55 pages or whatever. But I actually find that the development process is often longer, because a lot of times, and again, with limited series and all this stuff, there's no one standard way to do it. But a lot of times if people are writing a 1-hour drama pilot, you're going to have 3 or 4 storylines. So you kind of break each of those storylines separately and then weave them together into the episode, So that, I think, is the big difference, really.
Yeah, very cool. So we're right
Yeah,
out
go
of
ahead.
time. Do we want to do the giveaway thing so that people are dropping their numbers in while maybe we answer one last question?
Yes, that's a great idea. So quick, I think, rules. We're going to do 1 to 100, right? So if you can get into the chat and take one guess, put in one number between 1 and 100, and then we'll do you want to do 2 separate ones, one for each, or do you want to just do each of our numbers in one, everybody gets one guess?
Unless our number is exactly the same, which I don't think so. Yeah, I
I
think
don't
we
think
can just
so.
do one attempt at it. So yeah.
Okay, so if you'd like to be in the drawing or in the running, put one number between 1 and 100 in the chat, and then we'll have 2, packages, prize packages. Hudson's chosen a number and I've chosen a number, so whoever's closest to each of those will figure out a way to get your prize to you. And thank you for being here, everyone, while you're doing that. It's really nice of you to show up on a Saturday and take time out of your day to hang out with us. So that's really great.
For sure.
Okay, so while they're doing that, I'm going to look at the questions here. Okay, forgot where we left off. Okay, let's see. I sometimes make really small changes on the script and I'm not sure when I should call it a new draft. Ooh, that's a good question. Hudson, what do you think?
I mean, it's arbitrary, right? I mean, for me, I label my files with a date just so I knew when I did the last version of it for myself. If it's for a client, a producer or director or something, I usually take the date off. And we'll just say like version 1, version 2, or whatever. And so any number of rewrites I do in between there are for my personal self, but sending it to somebody. And then when I send it to, a manager or agent, or I'm trying to get someone interested in it, I take all of that kind of stuff off just so it reads like the final, so it doesn't say version, 1, so people don't think I've rewritten or whatever. But yeah, I don't think it really matters. I think it's just, why do you need to know if it's a new draft or not? If someone has asked you to do a rewrite, then it's not really about the number as much as it is about, did you do what they asked and did you accomplish that, whether you rewrote one paragraph or you rewrote the entire thing. But it's just kind of asking what's the purpose of keeping up with it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would say too, is that I always think of, a new draft is a fresh pass that you make on the script of any size, but that has a particular purpose. So like if you're just going in and kind of like tweaking punctuation and stuff like that, I don't consider that a new draft. But if you have a purpose, so you're opening the script with the idea of like, I'm going to implement Hudson's notes today, or I am going to fix this character's dialogue today, or this draft, right? Then when you've finished that thing that you were trying to achieve, then that's that I would consider the, conclusion of that new draft. But again, I agree. I don't think you necessarily have to get too caught up in how many drafts you've done,
Yeah, I will say I do make sure that you save your draft. So the reason I do the date thing is because sometimes I'll want to go back and say, oh, I really liked the previous version of that scene, or I want to pull a line from that, but I deleted it. And then you no longer have it. So I like to keep, every time I do a significant rewrite, I do a new date on the file name so I can go back and find that stuff. Because I've lost scenes before that I wish that I could go back to,
Yeah. Okay, here's a good character question for you. Jen says, I'm writing a comical villain and she has no arc. How can I make her more dimensional?
Gosh. I've certainly gotten the notes. I mean, it's when you have a comical villain, I've gotten the note of like, oh, they're just a joke. Oh, it's just a, kind of single bit. But I think it's, 3-dimension just means if you've got a villain who's always, funny, then add a heartwarming moment, add a terrifying moment, add, something that's against type to give them another dimension, in the same way that if you're writing a hero who's, always a Boy Scout, then how can you add a dimension that gives them, you know, a little more depth of, you know, they make the bad decision sometime, or they make a selfish decision at some point. It's just about looking at, all right, what is the one note that I'm hitting with this character, and how can I add an element that is a little bit against type? Because, you know, as human beings, none of us are all one thing. We are a multitude of emotions. And maybe a way to do that is, you know, looking at this character, what is the thing? Because I always think of characters in terms of obstacles and the choices that they make in the faces of those obstacles. That's how you really get to know somebody, right? You see how they react in the face of struggle. So what is the thing that you could throw in front of this character that would make them act differently? You know, what is the thing that, you know, Ratatouille, you got this hardened critic at the end, and he has a bite of this food and it changes and it shows a different side of him, right? So what is the obstacle that you can put in their way that's going to make them show a different side of themselves? This may be a good way to look at that.
Yeah, and I'll just tack onto that too. I think sort of an extension of that is, I would think about, you know, like Hudson said, we're all multidimensional people, and I think a big part of that is the way we show up in different scenarios and with different people. So it's like, I act one way with my brothers and a different way with my best girlfriends. You know what I mean? So if you can, it's not always possible for every character, right? If it's a villain, you might not see that person or that character in a lot of different situations. But if you can find, like you were saying, if you can find different scenarios where they're going to show up differently because of the power structure of the scene, or because of, you know, like what the thing that they're trying to convey to another character or whatever, that can give you some opportunities to show other dimensions of a character. And then the other thing I would say really quickly is just, again, not always possible with villain characters because we don't always get into them as much, but if you can help us understand their motivation, sometimes that's stakes related, right? But sometimes it's just kind of the thing that drives them in life. If we can understand that about a character, a lot of times that makes them just feel more rounded and more real to us, you know?
That's awesome. Super practical tips. Great.
Right. Okay, do you want to keep going with questions? Do you want to? Yeah. We can look at
let's do this giveaway. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to hold up your number?
Yeah, mine is 24.
Ooh, mine's 32.
Ooh, 32. So who's closest?
So let's see. I see a 37.
I think mine's gonna be GG. 6 away. 9, 20, 20.
Oh, I see a 36. Judith E.
It's closest for you.
It's closest for me.
All right.
Oh yeah,
Congrats.
but actually 36. Yeah. Who's your winner?
GG.
Oh, yeah.
And 18 is closest to 24.
Got it. Cool. Yay.
Yeah. Congrats, you guys. I have GG's info already. He's a pal, so I will reach out to him with my package. I don't know if you want to get it info for Judith so that you can send her what you need.
Yeah, Judith, if you would send me a private chat, or if you have my email address, if you can send me an email and let me know the best way to send you goodies, then I will get them out to you. Awesome. Okay, any last advice? Do you want to answer more questions? It's up to you. I
want to respect people's time. Before we go, I'm going to drop a link in here if anybody wants to try Script members for free for a month. You can go in and get a download of the book, look at our free resources, meet some other members in there and check it out. And just a reminder, you can pick up both Screenplay Outline Workbook and Writing Unforgettable Characters on Amazon. And you can find an easy link to both of those at the Zoom link you click to get here, scriptblast.com/Zoom.
Perfect. Cool. Thank you for doing that.
These other questions that we get to, I may try to answer just on my Instagram or over Twitter or something like that. We'll find a way to get to them. Cool.
Okay, great. Well, again, thank you everyone for being here. Thanks, Hudson, for organizing and being such a great co-host. And it was great to see everyone's faces. So yeah. Yeah, thank you guys. It's been very cool. We'll see you soon. All right. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye. Bye.